Hello and welcome back to the Haunted Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. If you're enjoying these tales, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from around the world. Now let the lights dim, the curtain rise, and may this story guide you into a deep, haunted sleep. The Ink That Dreamed. The town of Blackwood had always been a place where secrets lingered just beneath the surface. Tucked away amidst dense, towering pines, it was a town shrouded in perpetual fog, its streets winding like veins through a body long since dead. Eleanor Hayes had never intended to return to Blackwood. After leaving for college 10 years ago, she had sworn never to set foot in that town again. But when she received the call about her brother Daniel's sudden disappearance, she had no choice but to come back. The last place Daniel had been seen was the old Blackwood Library, a place long considered cursed by the locals. Built over a century ago, the library had been the site of numerous disappearances over the years, and the townspeople whispered that the books themselves harbored evil. As Eleanor approached the library, the air grew colder, and a heavy sense of dread settled over her. The towering stone building loomed before her like a dark sentinel, its windows dark and empty. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The scent of old paper and mildew assaulted her senses, and the silence was so profound it felt as if the building itself were holding its breath. "Daniel," she called, her voice echoing through the cavernous main hall. No answer. She moved deeper into the library, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Shelves towered over her, filled with books that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was then that she noticed the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoing through the silence. It was coming from the restricted section, a part of the library that had been closed off for decades. Eleanor swallowed hard and followed the sound. The deeper she went, the darker the library became. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, and the air grew colder still. At the end of the corridor, she found the source of the sound, a single book lying open on a reading table. Its pages fluttered as if an invisible hand were turning them. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath misting in the air. The book's title was faded, but as she leaned in, she could make out the words, "The Descent into Dread." And beneath the title, scrawled in a trembling hand, were the words, "Daniel was here." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the words. The ink appeared fresh, the letters trembling as if they had just been written. Her hands shook as she reached for the book, but before her fingers could touch it, the pages flipped on their own, stopping at a section titled "The Abyssal Library." A chill ran down her spine. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing against her as though the very walls of the library were closing in. The rhythmic tapping resumed, but now it sounded closer, as if someone were drumming their fingers against a wooden surface just behind her. Eleanor whirled around. No one was there. She exhaled shakily, turning back to the book. The page was filled with cryptic drawings, twisted, gnarled trees, the outline of a man with hollow eyes, and an open book with tendrils of darkness spilling forth. Beneath the drawings was a passage. The Abyssal Library is a place where words become flesh and ink becomes blood. Those who seek knowledge within its pages are doomed to be written into the story, never to escape its grasp. Eleanor's gaze darted around the library, her mind racing. Was Daniel trapped in here somewhere? She flipped to the next page. This one was blank, but as she stared, ink began to seep through the paper, forming words right before her eyes. "You are not alone, Eleanor. He is watching you." The ink continued to spread, spelling out more words. "Do you hear the tapping? That is the sound of those who are no longer here." Eleanor's breath hitched as the tapping grew louder, echoing through the library like the heartbeat of a giant, invisible beast. Her mind screamed at her to run, to flee this cursed place, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She couldn't leave, not without Daniel. Gathering her courage, Eleanor clutched the book and moved deeper into the restricted section. The air grew colder and the shadows grew darker, stretching across the floor like grasping hands. At the end of the corridor, she found a door she had never seen before, a massive wooden door carved with intricate, nightmarish patterns. Faces twisted in agony and eyes wide with terror stared back at her from the wood, their mouths open in silent screams. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering, dim candle at the center of the floor. And there, slumped against the far wall, was Daniel. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his lips moved soundlessly as if he were repeating something over and over again. Eleanor rushed to him, dropping to her knees. "Daniel! Daniel, can you hear me?" Daniel's eyes didn't move. His lips continued to move silently, but Eleanor could finally make out the words he was repeating. "The book writes itself. The book writes itself. The book writes itself." Suddenly, the candle sputtered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The tapping resumed, louder now, surrounding her from every direction. And then, just before the darkness swallowed her, a voice whispered in her ear. "You shouldn't have come back, Eleanor." Eleanor's scream echoed through the suffocating darkness, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence, as if the room itself absorbed the sound. The tapping ceased, and in the absence of noise, the silence grew heavy. A living, breathing entity pressing down on her. Her fingers fumbled for Daniel's hand. It was cold, unnaturally cold. "Daniel!" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please wake up." But Daniel remained motionless, his lips still moving in that eerie, repetitive chant. "The book writes itself. The book writes itself. The book writes itself." Eleanor's hands shook as she reached into her coat pocket, feeling for the small flashlight she always carried. With a click, the beam flickered to life, casting a pale, quivering light across the room. The walls, which had previously been empty, were now covered in writing. Ink dripped down the stone surfaces, forming words in a language Eleanor couldn't recognize. The ink seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. The book she had been carrying was now open on the floor, its pages flipping violently on their own. The ink continued to bleed across the paper, forming sentences, paragraphs, entire pages of text. And then Eleanor saw it, her own name, written over and over again. Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor. The ink swirled, forming sentences that made her blood run cold. She will be trapped within these pages, forever a part of the story, forever a part of the abyssal library. "No!" Eleanor shrieked, slamming the book shut. The tapping resumed, closer this time. It echoed from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. The flashlight beam quivered, and in the far corner of the room, Eleanor saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, all staring at her. Figures began to emerge from the shadows. Ghostly, hollow-eyed people, their skin gray and translucent, as if they had been drained of life. Their faces were contorted into expressions of agony, mouths open as if in a perpetual silent scream. "Eleanor," they whispered in unison, their voices melding into a single, dreadful chorus. "Help us, free us." Eleanor staggered backward, her heel catching on the edge of the book. She fell, the flashlight tumbling from her hand and rolling away, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the room. The figures advanced, their eyes fixed on her, hands reaching out, fingers twisted and gnarled like the roots of ancient, dying trees. "Daniel!" Eleanor sobbed, crawling toward him. Daniel's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide and unseeing. "It's too late, Eleanor," he said in a hollow, emotionless voice. "The book writes itself." The walls shuddered, the ink bleeding faster now, pouring down the stones like a waterfall of black blood. Words formed and reformed, spelling out Eleanor's fate with cruel precision. She will join the others. She will be written into the story, forever part of the abyssal library. The figures closed in around her, their whispers growing louder, merging into a cacophony of torment and despair. Eleanor's hands clawed at the floor, desperate to pull herself away, but their fingers wrapped around her wrists, their cold, clammy grip sinking into her skin like the touch of the dead. And then, as they dragged her toward the open book, Eleanor caught one last glimpse of Daniel. He was smiling, and his eyes were ink black. Eleanor's screams echoed through the cavernous room as the ghostly figures dragged her toward the book. Their fingers were ice cold, their grip relentless, and as they pulled her closer, the ink on the walls pulsated like a beating heart. "No," she shrieked, kicking and thrashing against their hold. "Let me go." But the figures remained silent, their hollow eyes fixed on her as they dragged her to the book lying open on the floor. The ink on its pages writhed like serpents, forming and reforming words that seared themselves into Eleanor's mind. The abyssal library takes what it is owed. The book writes itself. The story must continue. Eleanor's fingers scraped against the stone floor, nails breaking as she tried to claw herself free. The chill from the spectral hands seeped into her bones, and her vision blurred, the world tilting and swirling around her. "Daniel," she screamed, her eyes darting around the room. "Help me." But Daniel stood motionless in the center of the room, his eyes still ink black, his lips moving soundlessly as he recited the endless, mindless chant. "The book writes itself. The book writes itself. The book writes itself." The ink continued to pour from the walls, and Eleanor felt its wetness pooling beneath her, thick and sticky like blood. The figures pulled her closer to the book, and as she struggled, she saw her own reflection in the ink, her face twisted in terror, her eyes wide and filled with despair. "No," she gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want to be part of the story. Please." But the ink was already rising, slithering up her arms like black tendrils, seeping into her skin, staining her veins. The ghostly figures encircled her, their empty eyes staring down, their mouths opening wide. And then they began to sing. The sound was haunting, a low, mournful dirge that echoed through the room, the notes heavy with sorrow and longing. Their voices melded into one, creating a chilling, otherworldly harmony that vibrated through Eleanor's very bones. "The ink writes what it must," they sang. "The book takes what it will. The abyssal library opens wide, and the ink shall drink its fill." Eleanor's vision darkened, her body sinking into the ink, the tendrils wrapping around her neck, her wrists, her ankles. The ghostly figures loomed above her, their eyes glowing with a sinister, inky blackness. "Let her join the others," they whispered in unison. "Let her be part of the story." The ink surged up over Eleanor's face, filling her mouth, her nose, her eyes. She tried to scream, but the ink poured down her throat, drowning her in darkness. Darkness. Silence. Eleanor awoke to the sound of whispers. Soft, endless whispers. The air was heavy, suffocating, and she felt as though she were floating, weightless and cold. She opened her eyes. She was in a vast, endless library. The shelves stretched up into the void, filled with books that seemed to breathe, their pages fluttering as if moved by an unseen wind. Eleanor staggered to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. The floor was covered in ink, a thick, black pool that lapped at her ankles like waves. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing through the library. "Is anyone there?" But the only response was the soft, endless sound of pages turning. Eleanor took a step forward and the ink rippled beneath her, sending black waves cascading across the floor. The books whispered as she passed, and she could hear her name in their voices. "Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor." And then she saw them, the ghostly figures. They were all around her, standing between the shelves, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. Each of them held a book, its pages open, ink dripping from the paper and pooling at their feet. Eleanor's heart pounded as she approached one of them, a young girl with matted hair and a blank, staring face. The girl held the book out, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she read the words on the page. Eleanor Hastings was taken by the abyssal library, her soul forever trapped in the ink, her story forever unwritten. "No," Eleanor whispered, stumbling backward. But the ink continued to rise, climbing up her legs, her waist, her chest. The library grew darker, the shelves stretching higher and higher, the books whispering louder and louder. "The book writes itself," the ghostly figures chanted, their voices echoing through the void. "The book writes itself." The ink surged up over Eleanor's face, filling her mouth, her eyes, her ears. The last thing she saw was Daniel's face, watching her from the shadows, his ink-black eyes glistening with a cruel, empty smile. And then the ink swallowed her whole. Silence. Darkness. The library stood still, its shelves stretching into the void. The ink was calm, the pages silent. And somewhere in the darkness, a new book rested on the shelf. Its cover was black, its pages blank. But as the ink bled from the walls, the words began to form. Eleanor Hastings was taken by the abyssal library, her soul forever trapped in the ink, her story forever unwritten. The book writes itself. The story continues. The ink swirled around Eleanor, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Darkness closed in from all sides, and the sound of turning pages echoed like the rustling of dead leaves. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to hold on to any sense of herself, to remember who she was, what she was. But the ink was relentless. It filled her mouth, her lungs, her veins, thick and heavy like tar. She could feel it sinking deeper, burrowing into her mind, rewriting her thoughts, her memories, her very essence. "The book writes itself," a voice whispered in her ear. She turned, her eyes straining to find the source. Shadows flickered, shapes moving in the darkness. Figures emerged, ghostly and insubstantial, their faces blank and expressionless. They stared at her, their eyes empty, their mouths moving soundlessly as they whispered the words over and over. "The book writes itself. The book writes itself. The book writes itself." Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came out. The ink had taken her voice, swallowed it whole. The library loomed before her, endless and imposing. Its shelves towered into infinity, filled with books bound in black leather, their titles written in glistening ink that moved like living shadows. The floor was slick with the dark substance, and as Eleanor staggered forward, her feet sank into it, the ink rising up to her ankles, her knees, her waist. The whispers grew louder. The ghostly figures loomed closer. Their eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, unseeing. And then she saw it. In the center of the library, a single book sat on a pedestal of twisted roots and vines. The cover was black as night, the ink dripping from its pages like blood. The title glistened in the dim light, its letters forming and reforming in a language she could not understand. But somehow, She knew what it said, the unwritten. Eleanor's heart raced as she moved toward it, her feet dragging through the thick ink. The whispers grew louder, the voices rising in pitch, a chorus of agony and despair. She reached the pedestal, her hand trembling as she reached for the book. The ink on its cover was warm, almost pulsing like a heartbeat beneath her fingertips. And then, a voice echoed through the library, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You do not belong here," Eleanor gasped, her head snapping up. Shadows swirled above her, taking form, solidifying into a figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed a sickly, phosphorescent green, and its mouth was a gaping black void. "You were never meant to be part of the story," the figure said, its voice a rumbling, echoing growl. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, the ink splashing up around her like black water. "Please," she rasped, her voice raw and hoarse. "Let me go. I don't want to be here." The figure loomed closer, its massive form casting a shadow over her. Its eyes narrowed, and the ink around Eleanor began to rise, twisting and coiling like serpents. "But you are here," it said, "and now you must choose." The ink wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, pulling her down into the dark abyss. The whispers grew louder, the books on the shelves fluttering violently as if caught in a storm. Eleanor struggled, but the ink was too strong. It dragged her down, and as she sank deeper, she felt herself being pulled apart, her memories, her thoughts, her very soul unraveling like frayed threads. "Choose," the figure's voice echoed. "Will you write your own story? Or will you become just another unwritten soul?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at the book on the pedestal. Its pages were open, blank, waiting, and in that moment she understood. The ink was not just ink. It was the souls of those who had come before her, the ones who had been consumed by the abyssal library, their stories unwritten, their lives forgotten. But she still had a choice. With the last of her strength, Eleanor reached for the book, her hand shaking as she grabbed the quill that lay beside it. The ink surged up her arm, burning like acid, but she held firm. Her jaw clenched as she pressed the quill to the page, and she began to write. Her words flowed onto the page, the ink forming letters, sentences, paragraphs. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the library itself was resisting her. But Eleanor kept writing, her hand moving faster, the ink pouring from the quill like blood from a wound. She wrote about her life before the library, about Daniel, about the seance that had gone horribly wrong. She wrote about the darkness, the ink, the whispers. She wrote about the figure cloaked in shadows and the souls trapped in the books. And as she wrote, the ink around her began to recede, the darkness pulling away like a retreating tide. The ghostly figures faded, their whispers softening until they were nothing more than a distant echo. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as she wrote the final words, her hand shaking, her body weak and exhausted. And Eleanor Hastings escaped the abyssal library, her soul freed, her story her own. The ink quivered, the page trembled, and then the book snapped shut with a deafening clap. The ink vanished, the library dissolved into darkness, and Eleanor fell backward, her eyes closing as everything went black. When she awoke, she was lying on the floor of the seance room, the candles flickering weakly around her. Daniel was slumped against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale. "Daniel," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Eleanor?" She pushed herself up, her body aching, her limbs heavy. The room was quiet, the air still. The ink was gone, the whispers silent. But the book was still there, lying on the floor between them. Its cover was blank, its pages empty. Eleanor crawled toward it, her hand trembling as she picked it up. The ink had vanished, the pages clean and white. But as she flipped through them, she found a single line scrawled across the final page. "The book writes itself." Eleanor dropped the book, her eyes widening as the ink began to seep through the pages once more, dark and viscous, forming words that were not her own. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Daniel's arm. "We have to go. Now." Together, they stumbled toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the empty room. Behind them, the book lay open, its pages filling with ink, the whispers beginning to rise once more. The book writes itself. The story continues. The story continues. Eleanor and Daniel burst out of the seance room, slamming the door behind them. The hallway stretched before them, dim and claustrophobic, the wallpaper peeling like dead skin. Shadows flickered along the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something acrid and metallic. "Where are we?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor swallowed, her pulse pounding in her ears. "We're still in the house," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. The walls seemed to shift, stretching and contracting as if the very structure was breathing around them. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The doors they passed were closed, some splintered and rotting, others seemingly untouched. But behind each door, Eleanor could hear them, the whispers. The book writes itself. The story continues. "Where's the exit?" Daniel muttered, his eyes darting left and right. "This doesn't look like the hallway we came through." Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. The door to the seance room was gone. In its place was another endless corridor, lined with more doors, each identical, each closed. "This isn't real," she said, her voice shaking. "This can't be real." Daniel stopped, his hand gripping Eleanor's arm. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor listened, her breath hitching. The whispers had grown louder, closer. They pressed against her skull like a swarm of insects, their voices overlapping, a chaotic cacophony of half-formed words and desperate pleas. She felt something brush against her ankle, cold, slimy, wet. Eleanor looked down and bit back a scream. Ink was pooling around her feet, seeping up through the floorboards like a black tide. "It's the ink," Daniel said, his eyes wide with terror. "It's everywhere." The ink spread rapidly, bubbling and churning like a boiling sea. Faces formed in its surface, gaunt, hollow-eyed faces with mouths open in silent screams. They rose and fell, their features dissolving into blackness, only for others to emerge in their place. "They're the lost souls," Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. "The ones who never finished their stories." One of the faces rose up before her, its eyes fixing on hers. It was a woman, her skin gray and mottled, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands. "Help me?" the woman gasped, her voice a hoarse rasp. "Please finish my story." Before Eleanor could respond, the ink surged up, enveloping the woman, pulling her back into the darkness. "Run!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing Daniel's hand. They sprinted down the hallway, the ink rising behind them, sloshing against the walls like a living river. They burst through a door at the end of the corridor and stumbled into a vast, cavernous library. Shelves stretched up to the ceiling, filled with countless books, each bound in black leather, each glistening with ink. The floor was slick with the black substance, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. The whispers were louder here, deafening, a chorus of voices all crying out at once. "This is where it began," Eleanor said, her eyes darting around the room. "This is the library." Daniel moved to one of the shelves, his eyes scanning the spines of the books. "Look," he said, pulling one down. The cover was blank, the pages filled with ink that swirled and writhed, forming and reforming words that made no sense. He dropped the book, his hands shaking. "They're all empty." "No," Eleanor said, her jaw clenched. "They're not empty. They're waiting to be written." A shadow loomed overhead, blotting out the dim, flickering lights. Eleanor and Daniel looked up to see the dark figure from the seance room, its eyes glowing green, its mouth a black void. "You should not be here," the figure said, its voice a guttural growl. Daniel stepped back, his face pale. "What do you want from us?" The figure raised one clawed hand, and the ink rose up from the floor, forming tendrils that twisted and coiled around Daniel's legs, pulling him down. "Daniel!" Eleanor screamed, grabbing his arm. But the ink was too strong, its grip too tight. "Finish the story," the figure said, its eyes fixed on Eleanor, "or he will be lost." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled against the ink, her hands slipping against the slick, black tendrils. Daniel's eyes met hers, wide and terrified. "Finish it," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Write it down." The ink surged up, pulling him under, and then he was gone, swallowed whole by the darkness. Eleanor fell to her knees, the ink rising up around her, reaching for her, grasping for her. But she forced herself to her feet, her hands shaking as she stumbled toward the center of the library. There, on a pedestal of twisted roots, sat the book. Its cover was open, its pages blank, a quill lying beside it, dripping ink. "The book writes itself," the whispers echoed, a chorus of voices, each one more desperate than the last. Eleanor picked up the quill, her hand shaking as she pressed it to the page. The ink surged up around her, wrapping around her wrists, her neck, her legs. But she kept writing. Daniel was gone, lost to the ink, his story unfinished. But Eleanor refused to let him be forgotten. With each stroke of the quill, she fought against the darkness, her words forming sentences, paragraphs, pages. The ink quivered, the whispers growing louder, the books on the shelves shuddering violently. The dark figure loomed closer, its eyes blazing. "You cannot finish it," the figure said, its voice a low, echoing rumble. "The story is not yours to write." Eleanor's jaw clenched as she kept writing, her pen moving faster, the ink flowing like blood. She would not give up. She would not let him be lost. She would write his story, and she would make sure it was his own. The ink wrapped around her throat, squeezing, choking. Eleanor gasped, her vision blurring. But she kept writing, even as the ink rose up around her, even as the dark figure closed in. And as she wrote, the ink began to dissolve, the darkness pulling away, the whispers fading. The library trembled, the books falling from the shelves, the pages tearing free and turning to dust. The ink surged one last time, a wave of darkness rising up, crashing down, and then there was silence. Eleanor opened her eyes to find herself lying on the floor of the seance room. The candles were flickering weakly, and the air was cold and still. She sat up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The book was still in her hand, its pages blank, its cover closed. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking. There was no answer. Eleanor forced herself to her feet, the room spinning around her. The walls were intact, the ink gone, the whispers silent. But Daniel was nowhere to be found. She looked down at the book in her hands, her eyes widening as she saw the words forming on the first page, written in dark, glistening ink. The book writes itself. The story continues. And beneath it, a single line. Daniel is waiting. Eleanor's hands trembled as she flipped to the next page, and the next, and the next, each one blank, each one waiting to be written. She fell to her knees, the book slipping from her grasp, the whispers rising once more. The story continues. The story continues. Eleanor sat in the middle of the seance room, her back against the cold, rotting wall. The book lay open in her lap, its pages blank, the quill resting beside it, dripping ink like black blood. The whispers had subsided, but the silence was worse. She traced a shaking finger over the empty pages, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in around her, the ceiling pressing down, the darkness coiling like a serpent. "Daniel is waiting," she whispered, her voice hollow. The words echoed in the empty room, fading into nothingness. The book twitched in her lap, and a single line of ink began to form on the page. "I can hear you, Eleanor. I'm still here." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She grabbed the quill, dipping it into the ink, her hand shaking as she wrote. "Where are you?" The ink bled into the page, and then the words appeared, one by one, in Daniel's familiar handwriting. "I'm trapped. It's dark, so dark. I can hear them. They're all around me. Can't get out. Finish the story, Eleanor. You have to finish the story." Eleanor's eyes burned with tears. "How?" she asked aloud, her voice breaking. "How do I finish it?" The book shuddered in her lap, and the ink began to flow across the pages, forming a single, chilling sentence. "You must write the ending." The room seemed to darken further, the shadows pressing in, the air growing colder. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry, and raised the quill. She wrote for what felt like hours, her hand cramping, her eyes stinging. The ink bled across the pages, each word forming like a wound opening in the paper. The whispers grew louder as she wrote, rising and falling like a relentless tide. Daniel stood in the library, the ink rising around him, cold and suffocating. The walls stretched and twisted, the shelves bending like bones, the books bleeding ink that pooled at his feet. The dark figure loomed above him, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light, its voice a low, rumbling growl. Eleanor stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The ink continued to flow, the book writing itself now, each word forming of its own accord. The dark figure reached for Daniel, its long, clawed fingers closing around his neck, pulling him down into the ink. "No!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing the quill, scratching out the words. The ink splattered, the pages tearing, but the words kept forming, relentless and unyielding. He sank deeper, the ink filling his lungs, the whispers drowning him, pulling him under. Eleanor clenched her jaw, her grip on the quill tightening. "I won't let it end this way," she hissed, slashing the quill across the page. The ink surged, spilling over the edges of the book, pooling onto the floor. The whispers grew louder, their voices frantic and desperate. "You must finish the story, Eleanor, or he will be lost." Eleanor's heart pounded as she dipped the quill in the ink and pressed it to the page, her hand shaking. But Daniel fought back. He clawed at the ink, his hands slick with the black sludge, his eyes burning with defiance. He would not sink. He would not be drowned. He would not be forgotten. The ink recoiled, the black tendrils pulling back, the whispers growing fainter. The walls seemed to solidify, the room stabilizing, the air warming. Eleanor kept writing, her movements frantic, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Daniel rose, his body shaking, the ink dripping from his skin. The dark figure loomed above him, its eyes blazing, its mouth opening wide, a gaping void of endless darkness. The ink surged again, splashing across the page, but Eleanor didn't stop. She kept writing, her words scrawling across the page, her hand aching. But Daniel would not yield. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the dark figures, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling. "You're not real," he said, his voice strong. "You're just a story, and stories can end." The ink shuddered, the dark figure recoiling, its form flickering like a dying flame. The ink began to drain away, the darkness receding, the whispers fading into silence. Daniel stood in the center of the library, the floorboards creaking beneath him, the air heavy and still. Eleanor's hand stopped, the quill slipping from her fingers. The room was silent now. The ink had ceased flowing. The book lay open, its pages blank once more. She looked around, her breath coming in slow, steady waves. The seance room was empty, the candles flickering weakly, their light dim and cold. "Daniel," she whispered. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes fixed on the figure emerging from the darkness. Daniel stepped forward, his clothes soaked in ink, his skin pale and cold. But his eyes were clear, his expression weary but alive. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling. "You did it." Eleanor rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck, the tears spilling over her cheeks. "I thought I lost you," she sobbed. "I thought you were gone." Daniel held her tight, his body shaking, the ink dripping from his fingers. "You brought me back," he whispered. "You finished the story." Eleanor pulled back, her hands cupping his face. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice small, Daniel's eyes darkened. "Not yet," he said, glancing down at the book still lying open on the floor. Eleanor followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. The ink was moving again, seeping up through the floorboards, pooling around the book, staining the pages black. A single line of text appeared, written in dark, glistening ink. "The story continues." Eleanor and Daniel watched in stunned silence as the ink continued to spread across the pages of the book, the dark tendrils crawling like spiders' legs. The whispers started again, faint and distant, like voices heard through a thick fog. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice a rasp. Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the book. "It's not over," she said, her throat tightening. "It's never over." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "We need to destroy it," he said, taking a step toward the book. But as he moved, the ink surged up from the pages, lashing out like a living thing. It coiled around Daniel's ankles, pulling him down, and he fell hard to the floor with a strangled cry. "Daniel!" Eleanor screamed, reaching for him. But as she lunged forward, the ink shot toward her too, wrapping around her wrists and dragging her back against the wall. The ink was cold and clammy, like the touch of a corpse. It moved like a snake, tightening its grip, forcing her arms behind her back. The whispers grew louder, pressing against her skull, insistent and maddening. "You didn't finish the story," they chanted, over and over again. Daniel struggled against the inky bonds, his face contorted in pain. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. But the ink only tightened, pulling them both closer to the book. The pages fluttered, turning of their own accord, each page filled with words written in thick, black ink. Eleanor's eyes widened as she read the words. The ink bled from their veins, their bodies consumed by the story they could not finish. They became the ink, the words, the darkness, forever trapped within the pages. "No," Eleanor gasped, her pulse pounding. "That's not how it ends." She strained against the ink, her muscles burning, her vision blurring. She could feel it now, the ink seeping into her skin, crawling up her arms, burrowing beneath her flesh. It was cold and thick, like mud, clogging her veins, suffocating her from the inside. Daniel's screams echoed in her ears, but he was already sinking into the ink, his body dissolving, his eyes wide and terrified. "Daniel!" Eleanor sobbed, the ink pouring into her mouth, choking her, drowning her. The whispers grew deafening, 1,000 voices screaming in her skull. "You must finish the story." Eleanor's vision went black. The world spun away, and she was falling, sinking, drowning in the ink, the darkness consuming her, devouring her, until there was nothing left but silence. Somewhere in the darkness, a faint light flickered. Eleanor opened her eyes, gasping for air. She was lying on a cold, stone floor, her clothes soaked in ink, her skin sticky and cold. She sat up, her head pounding, her vision swimming. The room was vast and empty, the walls made of dark, polished stone. The air was thick and oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. In the center of the room stood the book, open on a stone pedestal. The ink was still moving, still writing, the words forming and then dissolving like smoke. Eleanor pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. "Daniel," she called, her voice echoing in the empty chamber. There was no answer. She staggered toward the book, her steps heavy and unsteady. The ink pulsed across the pages, forming words in a language she could not understand. The whispers surrounded her, pressing against her mind, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "You are the story," they said. "You are the ink. You are the words." Eleanor shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't be part of this. I won't let you trap me." The ink surged up from the book, forming a towering figure, a dark, writhing mass of ink and shadows. It had no face, only hollow, gaping eyes that oozed black ichor. Its mouth stretched open, and the whispers poured out like a torrent of black ink. Eleanor backed away, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The ink figure loomed over her, its arms outstretched, its fingers long and clawed. "Finish the story," it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl. Eleanor's back hit the wall. There was nowhere to run. The ink was spreading, pooling across the floor, reaching for her ankles, pulling her down. Her eyes fell on the book, still open on the pedestal. The ink was moving, forming words. But these words were different. They weren't commands or threats, they were a plea. "Write your way out," the ink said. "Write the ending. Write the truth." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to her feet, her muscles burning, her veins aching with the cold, suffocating ink. She staggered to the pedestal, grabbed the quill, and dipped it into the ink. The ink figure roared, its voice shaking the room, its massive form collapsing inward, turning into a swirling vortex of darkness. Eleanor pressed the quill to the page, her hand shaking, and began to write. The ink was not real. The darkness was not real. The story was not real. Eleanor was real, and she would not be trapped. She would not be consumed. She would fight back. The ink figure screamed, its form twisting and writhing, its eyes burning with fury. "You cannot escape," it bellowed, lunging toward her. But Eleanor kept writing, the ink flowing from the quill, each word forming like a sword, each sentence like a shield. The ink dissipated, the darkness receded, the whispers fell silent. The book closed, its pages blank once more. The ink was gone. The story was over. The ink figure shrieked, its form collapsing inward, the darkness swallowing it whole. The room shook, the stone walls cracking, the floor splitting open. Eleanor kept writing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her vision blurring. The ink was almost gone now, the words fading, the pages turning white. And Eleanor was free. The ink figure exploded, a tidal wave of darkness washing over her, drowning her, pulling her down, down, down. And then there was nothing but silence. Eleanor woke to the sound of birds singing. She opened her eyes, blinking against the soft, warm light streaming through the window. She was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her chin. The air was warm and still, the room bathed in golden morning light. For a moment, she lay there, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching for any trace of ink, any sign of darkness. But there was nothing. Only the morning light, the soft rustle of leaves outside, the distant chirping of birds. The book lay on the nightstand, its cover closed, its pages blank. Eleanor sat up, her hands trembling. Was it a dream? She whispered. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped into the room, a tray of tea in his hands, a warm smile on his face. "Morning," he said. "You okay?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, her heart swelling with relief. "Yeah," she said, her voice breaking. "I think I am." Daniel sat beside her, placing the tray on her lap. "You had a bad night," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But it's over now." Eleanor glanced at the book, her gaze lingering on its blank cover. "Yeah," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It's over." But deep within the pages, a single drop of ink seeped through the paper, forming a single, ominous word. "Continue." Weeks had passed. The old manor had been sealed off by local authorities after Eleanor and Daniel reported the strange occurrences, though they omitted most of the truth. They claimed structural collapse, hallucinations from toxic mold, and a narrow escape. The real story they kept between themselves and the silence. Eleanor had moved to a quiet cottage by the sea. The sound of waves comforted her, a rhythm that grounded her when nightmares stirred. Daniel visited often, and their friendship had grown deeper, forged in the black crucible of what they had survived. Neither spoke of the book anymore. They never had to. One foggy evening, Eleanor sat at her desk, staring at a fresh page in her journal. The desk was bare save for a simple fountain pen, no ink bottle. She had stopped using ink long ago. She began to write. Not a story, not a confession, but a closure. The ink is memory, desire, hunger. It dreamed through us. But dreams end. I've written my way back into the light. She closed the journal and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, there were no whispers. No shadows. Then she heard it, faint, almost imagined. A soft scratching, like a quill on parchment. She stood, slowly turned. The old book was not on the nightstand. It was not in the cottage at all. But on her window pane, a single word had appeared, drawn in dark condensation. Again. She stared at it. Then she smiled, not with fear, but resolve. Not this time, she whispered. She opened the window and let the sea breeze carry the last of the ink away. And in the hush of twilight, the story finally ended, not with a scream, but with silence. The book would wait, as it always had. But Eleanor had closed her chapter.